Good evening. Welcome to the launch of Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, Police Abolition in Canada. I'm Kevin Walby, a settler on Treaty 1 territory in the homeland of the Métis Nation, one of the three editors of the book, introducing the evening with another co-editor, Shiri Pasternak. Thank you to Between the Lines, our publisher, for hosting, to Another Story bookstore in Toronto for co-sponsoring, plus David from BTL for making everything happen. We wanted to set the context for tonight and introduce our hosts. Between the first and second waves of COVID during the height of the George Floyd mobilizations across the continent, this book started to take shape. That spring, May 27th, 2020, Regis Korchinski-Paquette, an Afro-Indigenous woman, fell to her death from a high-rise balcony as she struggled to escape from officers performing a so-called wellness check. Fatally shot by local police June 4th, Chantel Moore died in another so-called wellness check in Edmundston, New Brunswick. She was a member of the Clayoquot First Nation. Days later, in the same province, Royal Canadian Mounted Police shot and killed Rodney Levi, a Mi'kmaq man, a member of the Metep and First Nation, during another so-called wellness check. And in June, Ijaz Ahmed Chowdhury, 62, was killed in Malton, Ontario, by Peel Regional Police, who were called to yet another fatal wellness check. None of the officers in any of these cases were held responsible or faced any reprimand. Yet every time people mobilized in the streets and organized locally for abolition and defunding of police, Canadian pundits, politicians, and media tried to frame this movement as copycat protests, claiming that we don't have a racism problem here, that we don't have a police brutality problem here, that we don't live in a carceral society.
So we reached out to abolitionists across the country, asking if people would like to write a collection together, and people were into it. And they added more names to the thread, and new people saw other people who were missing, and they added more names. And the deadlines came and went, and some blew by. And finally, we got to the final deadline. And these incredible practitioners and theorists of abolition had come through. When we got together to talk about what we wanted the book to be, here's what we agreed on. Abolition is a commitment to building safer, stronger, more just, radically inclusive, sustainable, worker-protected, loving, and free communities together instead of relying on institutions of state violence to govern our lives. That is the work that we do across all sectors, communities, issues, and forms of harm. We reject the metrics, the current metrics of justice. We reject the formula that Indigenous people are over-incarcerated in Canada. No, having people locked up proportionately to their population demographics is not justice. Decolonization and land back is justice. This intervention is only a murmur of the groundswell of love organized into forms of community care across this country. We hold abolition on our horizon, and we move towards it every day, one step at a time. Without further ado, it's our greatest privilege and honor to introduce two of the most brilliant leaders of abolition in this country, perhaps not by their choice, but surely by their work, their thinking, and the respect it commands and inspires, Elle Jones and Desmond Cole. Elle Jones recently authored one of the most critical resources available on what defunding the police could look like with the Halifax report titled Defunding the Police, Defining the Way Forward for HRM. Elle Jones is a radio host, poet, activist, scholar, teacher, community organizer, and journalist based in Halifax. Desmond Cole, author of best-selling and award-winning book, The Skin We're In, A Year of Black Resistance and Power, is a freelance journalist and activist whose public intellectualism has shaped the landscape of power in Canada. Turning it over to you two now with our deepest thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, Shiri, and thank you, Kevin, and everybody involved in this book. Desmond, that was a go to you.
Good evening, everybody. It's really wonderful to be with you for the launch of this. Elle and I are really excited to speak with several of the contributors to Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, and to further the conversation that was mentioned that has been happening in this country, a conversation which rightfully needs to be situated in so-called Canada, but which too often, as Elle has written about, and as I have written about, and as many others have, too often this conversation becomes swallowed up in a narrative that we are trying to mimic or parrot something that is happening in the United States. So to have so many brilliant activists, scholars, thinkers, organizers, activists, contributors tonight to think through this with us is really exciting, and we're honored to be with you.
This collection is actually already available. It was released at the beginning of this month, so you can get it at your local bookstore, or you can go online at Between the Lines. And this collection comes at a time where we've also seen a lot of backlash to the concept of defunding, whether that's people quibbling the name defunding. We've seen police obviously trying to reinstall themselves into our communities, whether that's through like hate crimes or claiming that they do work on sexual assault. We've also seen, for example, The Breach just released an investigation by one of the contributors to this book, Ted Rutland, showing how the police actually were manipulating polls to make it look like public opinion did not support defunding and leaking that to the media. So we also, as we go through this collection tonight, we also know that this is not a symbol of finished work by any means. This work is just beginning. This is not all the work that is being done and cannot possibly comprehend that. And this is work that is still facing pushback, invalidation. People are facing violence as they do this organizing as well. So this is a living collection that really captures a moment that is ongoing and a movement that has been ongoing for generations. This is not a new idea. It's an idea that burst into mainstream consciousness in a particular way, and that we will be continuing to fight for generations. And this book captures some of that work, some of that energy tonight. And we're so grateful to all the contributors who took their time across this country, so-called Canada, to provide us with this book.
Yes, and before we jump into the first contributors, I just want to remind everybody that Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, this event this evening has been co-sponsored by Between the Lines, of course, and Another Story Bookshop. We're very grateful to them, as well as our media sponsor, Briar Patch Magazine. So be sure to buy this book wherever you can. If you're able to support independent media, independent booksellers, that is a wonderful thing. We support that too. But thank you to our sponsors. Thank you to all of you for being with us this evening. And Elle, you're going to take us to the first contributors.
We are going to be moving quite quickly this evening. We are trying to get you out on time. We know it's Good Friday, etc. tomorrow, if that's your thing. I should have said as well, I'm in Jabuktuk, Halifax, the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. And Desmond, you are in?
Treaty 13, territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, and most recently, a treaty with the Huron, or the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Thank you, Elle.
And we don't just say that as something to mouth. We say that because understanding the land on which we are and the history of that land is a huge part of abolition. And to begin to frame that for us, we're really grateful to start off the evening with some representatives from Free Lands, Free Peoples. We have Abby Stadnick and Molly Swain joining us. Carrie is not joining us tonight, but is part of this chapter as well. And they're going to talk to you about chapter 9 in the book, which is called A Brief Introduction to Anti-Colonial Abolition. So welcome. And I know you have a presentation, so you can take it away. Go ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Elle and Desmond, for that introduction. Really excited and honored to be here, and I will just dive right in. So in our chapter, the members of Free Lands, Free Peoples provide a very brief introduction and an overview of anti-colonial abolition as we understand and practice it as Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living in the prairie region of so-called Canada. We ground our work always in conversation with the organizing and theorizing of the late Cree prisoner justice activist Corey Cardinal, as well as the justice traditions of the Nehiyaw and Métis peoples to whom the majority of our members belong. So anti-colonial abolition really asks us to grapple with the creation and expansion of prisons and policing as crucial colonial tactics to remove and contain Indigenous peoples, to open up our lands for resource extraction and settlement, and to maintain that access for the use and enjoyment of settlers. So Canada has really unilaterally subjected Indigenous peoples to its punitive and carceral injustice system. And the existence of police and prisons on Indigenous lands is a direct and deliberate violation of Indigenous sovereignty. At the same time, Indigenous peoples continue to uphold and practice our own traditional justice and legal regimes. So in the prairies and in many other territories, these regimes center accountability through relationality and collective modes of care and support. So recognizing the responsibility that we all have to uphold and maintain good relations with one another, other than human beings, and the land, waters, and air. So an anti-colonial abolitionist lens also allows us to elucidate that Indigenous resistance, organizing, and treaty making are really key sites of contemporary assertions of Indigenous justice in the face of ongoing state violence. This chapter also turns its gaze to the colonial functions of policing itself as hostile occupying forces of the settler state, which are designed and deployed to suppress not only Indigenous political, legal, and social resistance to the ongoing ravages of colonialism, but also to undermine the survival of Indigenous peoples. The policing tactics used to assert and protect white interests range from active violence against Indigenous individuals and communities to upholding broader social conditions that threaten and devalue Indigenous lives and rights. From the creation of the explicitly anti-Indigenous Royal Canadian Mounted Police, which continue to be the biggest policing body in the country, to military invasion, daily violence and harassment, to the mobilization of settler lay people, just everyday settlers, to protect the white supremacist colonial status quo, an anti-colonial analysis of policing recognizes that police on Indigenous lands operate with a broad social mandate that legitimizes and even valorizes anti-Indigenous violence. And I'll pass it to Abby to chat a bit about the rest.
Thanks. And I just, of course, lost my notes. Okay, thanks. Hi, very happy and honored to be here. I'm Abby Stadnick. I'm a white settler, scholar, and organizer living in Misquachie, also known as Edmonton, Alberta. In our chapter, in addition to police, we also talk about prisons. And our chapter is important, I think, as are others in the book, for the way that it stresses that any anti-colonial abolitionist analysis of policing must also include an analysis of prisons and vice versa. These two systems work together as part of a carceral network that from its inception has been engineered to maintain and expand settler colonialism and support the ongoing genocide of Indigenous peoples. So in the section of the chapter on prisons, we begin with the work of Eric Young, who's a Soto man and a former prisoner, who makes clear the connection between the current prison system and another penal system, the Indian residential school system. As a residential school survivor, he says, I found living in prison to be the same as residential school. I was brought up in residential school, so jail was like a second home to me. This idea of prisons as the new residential schools was popularized in a 2016 Maclean's magazine article, but what is less well known is the long history of these two intertwined carceral institutions. One of the first residential schools in the United States, for example, was modeled on a prison where Plains Indigenous men were incarcerated as prisoners of war in the 19th century. So the rehabilitationist drive of today's prisons is rooted in the program of assimilation and the quote unquote civilizing mission of carceral institutions of the past. What this history and our analysis make clear is that prisons are an ongoing mechanism of settler colonial warfare against Indigenous peoples. We conclude the chapter by turning to examples of Indigenous resistance as Indigenous justice. The many movements of Indigenous peoples, including Idle No More and Land Back, for example, place relationality and mutual responsibility to be in good relations at their core, and in so doing enact Indigenous justice and abolitionist futures. To protect the land and communities, we argue that we must move against the state and toward the creation of interdependent, community-oriented, and self-determined justice systems of care and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have a little bit of time for questions. A very brief question I wanted to ask, and I'll throw to Desmond if he has one, is could you perhaps say something about the different positioning of abolition in this Indigenous frame as opposed to reconciliation, which is being pursued by so many institutions? So is there a difference? How do they relate? Or do you see this as an alternative vision?
Yeah, so I want to thank the youth leadership of the Wet'suwet'en blockades in 2020 for stating what I think a lot of us knew, if not from the outset, very early on about reconciliation, which is that it was a dead end. It was going to be a non-starter from the get-go as soon as the state really took it up and started running with it. I think for us, anti-colonial abolition, we position it very firmly against the state, as Abby mentioned, and recognize that, like prison and police reforms, often what we see when it comes to reconciliation is new ways of justifying and legitimizing the settler status quo. And so I think for us, Indigenous abolitionism really cuts through sort of reformist notions of being able to maintain the system as it currently is. And to really look to both new and old ways of thinking and being together to build something that people can really survive under. Abby, did you want to add anything?
Nope, that's perfectly expressed, Molly.
We have time for one quick question for you, and then we do have to move on. Desmond, if you have a final question.
Sure. I just want to echo Molly's sentiment that we say rest in peace to Corey Cardinal. And I just would like to ask you briefly about the work of people inside the prison walls, inside of jail today, particularly during COVID-19, that is allowing us to imagine a new way of doing things in this country. A lot of things have happened during COVID that were previously, we were told they were impossible to happen. And so I wonder if you can connect that to directly the advocacy and the work of people who are incarcerated today.
Yeah, thanks for that, Desmond. Corey was a dear friend of mine and worked with Freelance Free Peoples over the last couple of years when he was incarcerated, and he was doing a lot of advocacy work for prisoners' rights in the Saskatoon Correctional Centre and for people and primarily Indigenous people incarcerated in Saskatchewan jails. I think one of the projects that Freelance Free Peoples is currently working on is Corey Cardinal's archive of work and the tremendous sort of volume of theory that he created while he was incarcerated and on the outside, but theory that really puts forward the analysis on which we build of prisons and policing as genocidal state mechanisms. So I think he did a ton of work to bring together prisoners and people on the outside to sort of advocate for prisoner rights, to raise awareness of what's going on inside prisons and the horrific conditions inside prisons, and that have been amplified during COVID, but that we know to always exist inside these carceral institutions. So yeah, thanks for mentioning Corey. He's really close to my heart, and always when I do this work, we're thinking of him and his memory and what he was able to accomplish in terms of building connections and relationships as well between people across the country, between people at different institutions, between people on the inside and the outside. Like, he really was a special person with a lot of power to move people. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you, and thank you so much to Corey for his work as well. That is the time we have. I told you this night is moving very fast, so Desmond is going to introduce the next group. That was Molly and Abby, and the chapter is called A Brief Introduction to Anti-Colonial Abolition. And Desmond, if you can now introduce our next presenters. I
will. Thank you, Elle. I want to say that somebody in the chat has mentioned the limitations of descriptive chat, and so asking if we can give any details about what's on the screen. I would like to say that I'm here speaking to you in my apartment with a white background with some books in the background. I'm wearing a red sweater. I have a little bit more hair than maybe a short version of me has with my little tiny afro poof, and I'm slightly bearded. So we have to remember that there are different people who are accessing this conversation this evening, and we want to be able to create an experience for everybody who's watching and listening. So thank you very much for that in the chat. I would like to introduce our next two contributors, Elaine Lamb and Chanel Gallant, who are the authors of chapter 14, which is entitled Rights Not Rescue, Defending Migrant Sex Workers from Policing. It is a great honor to speak with both of you, and please begin by giving us a summary of your chapter. Welcome.
Hey, everyone. Okay, first I'll just introduce myself. My name is Chanel Gallant, and I am a white woman wearing glasses with shoulder length dark hair and a kind of sleeveless jumpsuit thing. And I think some nice lip gloss I'm rocking. And I'll pass it to you, Elaine.
Hi everyone, I'm Elaine Lam. So I have black hair and I have the full moon face, and so I have a little bit yellow skin. So I am Asian from Hong Kong, and I'm so glad to be here. And I hope this echo don't affect everyone. So I'm actually in Oka because there is a Asian Artists Festival. We are having a community event here. So.
Okay, Elaine, do you want me to start? Okay. Unless, wait, did you guys have a question?
Do you want to maybe just introduce a bit about your work in the chapter, and then we'll ask a question to follow up?
Okay, sure. Okay, so briefly, I have been active in movements for sex workers' rights against policing for many years, almost 20 years. And I have been working with Elaine since, I don't know, maybe 2013 or 2014, a long time. And we wrote a chapter in this book called Rights Not Rescue, Defending Migrant Sex Workers from Policing. So that's a little bit, and the chapter is basically looking at why migrant sex workers need police abolition in order to achieve safety, rights, and freedom. That's like the very basics about the chapter.
Yeah, and I think that we do not describe a lot of the book chapter, because we really want you to read, and not only our chapter, but whole book. You do not only need to read it, you need to buy it for your friends, and then, because this is so important, because you are not only sitting here listening to us, we really want to call you to be part of the abolitionist movement, because we know how police is so harmful for many, many communities, how the state power extension is actually make people's lives suffer. And using the name of protection, particularly we used the example of anti-trafficking movement, is very clear that it's like they look like helping, and the anti-trafficking movement is the strong foundation of supporting the policing, the criminalization, particularly racialized, marginalized community and migrant, and so that, and also that policing is not only carried out by police, and also this carried out by social service organization, social worker, and those carceral feminists. And then why they work together so well? Because they are the group of people uphold the white supremacy. So one of the example is we just fighting in the Newmarket. So Newmarket is all councillors are white. And so that what they do is they change the bylaw of massage parlor, because some other white religion group and anti-trafficking organization, they also have religion background. They say, oh, there is a lot of trafficking in Asian massage parlor. Then they change the bylaw. Now have no Asian worker can work anymore in Newmarket. So this is the example. And who are supporting this, right? So because they use the term anti-human trafficking, and people think it's the good thing. And so that they also use it, they can call the police, and they produce that illegality. So the other example of policing is like government, when they have no funding for housing, no funding for food, and they spend, like Ontario government spent $300 million for anti-trafficking movement. Most money go to police. And now police, they want to show their work more just, and then now they partner with social worker. And this is all the awful thing they have been doing. But when Ford say, I am anti-trafficking, you see that he gets so much like and so much support, even no matter the people on the left, no one against it. And the Bill 251 is the bill that extend the police power. Even the abolitionists, that some people say they're against the policing, they don't stop it, and they do not fight against it. They extend the power. They can detain the youth without just give the power and social worker to detain the youth, and no one criticizes it, because they use the notion of helping to cover it. Other example is Canadian Center to End Human Trafficking. They received $14 million and say they have the hotline help the people. But the hotline actually is funded by the public safety to get the data. So other kind of surveillance, and so much money go to social service organization, is the extension of police power. So this is something we really, really hope that more people, if you are abolitionists, please stand with us to stop this anti-trafficking movement. And you need to learn there is a lot of things already written about. And whole book is so amazing and beautiful that is like talking about how different aspects like that, the harmful of policing. So, and I think I give back Chanel, because like this is only one piece of our work, and then we have like tons of work need to do. But your support is so important. Read the book, but also be the abolitionist. Educate your friend and send the book to many, many people that to make us be more strong. Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one question. Desmond's going to do a follow-up, and then we do have to keep moving on. I know this night is going so quickly. There's so much that's rich in this book, but Desmond, go ahead, and then we will keep moving.
Well, I was actually thinking, and I think Chanel and I even recently were having a conversation about how since the Harper years and Bill C-36, so little has changed in the big picture of legislation around sex work. And I wonder, have the demands changed since that time? Are people still fighting for the same political demands? What, if anything, has changed since the time of Bill C-36, when it seems like the Harper government was trying to surface address this issue, but we have not heard much from the Trudeau government in now, what, 6 years?
Yeah, the Trudeau government actually just did a series of consultations, hearings on the most recent sex work laws, but no, nothing substantially changed. So what happened, and I think what Elaine, one of the things I want to go back to that Elaine was talking about was that the face of sex work criminalization has changed, and now instead of considering sex workers criminals, the law treats them as human trafficking victims, and considers whoever it wants to be human trafficking victims. And so, our concern really, and this is one of the reasons we were so shocked. I was so shocked to see so many sex work contributors in this volume. I was like, wow, this is incredible badasses. We are an amazing company. I feel so proud to be in this collection, honestly. I didn't know who was going to be in it. And then also I was like, oh my God, we're not the token sex worker contribution. There's multiple sex worker contributions. So it means the book actually gets to look at, from the perspective of criminalized communities, what policing does and what abolition of policing could do. And what our chapter tries to argue, we show, is that contemporary policing of sex work operates under the auspices of the anti-trafficking industry. And unfortunately, it operates with a lot of support from progressives and leftists and feminists who see the anti-trafficking industry not as what it is, which is a carceral system of violence against sex workers, but they think it's humanitarian. They think it's feminist. And sex workers have been fighting the anti-trafficking industry since its inception. But then you have the left somehow being like, oh, ACAB except for sex workers. Oh, yeah, like cops are useless, violent, racists, but we need them to rescue the trafficking victims. And in fact, what they do is criminalize sex workers and abuse them with impunity under the auspices of trafficking. So this is one of the reasons I think this collection is so unique and so special, is I see so many abolitionist collections that don't place sex work into the conversation. And then what happens is they miss an entire form of carceral power. Because you need sex work communities to talk about the anti-trafficking industry, because no other community is as affected by it in the same way. Go
Yeah, I know need to give time to other speakers, so but I think it's very important, no matter movement and also how the law is targeting, how race and migration is also the core issue, how racialized people being targeted, and also how migrant is being targeted in specifically, of course, poor in this like poor anti-trafficking.
Thank you so much to both of you. So we can see that this is a chapter that engages policing of sex work, carceral feminism, migrant rights as well. So sounds extremely rich. And I hope, as you said, everyone buys it. So that chapter is Rights, Not Rescue, Defending Migrant Sex Workers from Policing. Thank you to both of you for your contributions to this book and for speaking tonight. And we are, I haven't described myself. I'm sorry. So I am light-skinned Black woman. I have long hair right now. I'm wearing a light gray shirt, and I'm sitting in my apartment in front of a bookcase filled with books. And I'm now going to introduce Ted Rutland, who is with the Defund the Police Coalition in Montreal and is the author of Chapter 4, Defund to Abolish, a 400-year struggle against policing in Montreal. Good evening, Ted. Welcome.
Good evening. Thanks so much, Al. So I'm coming to you from occupied Kanien'kehá:ka territory, otherwise known as Tiohtià:ke, otherwise known as Montreal. I am speaking in front of a bunch of books. Like many of us, I have curly red hair and a beard. I co-authored this chapter with Sandra Wesley from Stella, a sex worker herself and sex worker organizer. She's down with COVID, so couldn't be here tonight. And also co-authored it, with a lot of input from the Defund the Police Coalition in Montreal. And what all of us tried to do with this chapter was to try to provide a tool for us here in Montreal, but then also to situate this struggle across so-called Canada within a really, really long struggle against policing in settler colonial territory, in territory marked by the enslavement of African people, in a territory marked by deep social hierarchies that have existed here from the beginning. And so we call it 400 years of resistance against policing because the French settlers who came to Tiohtià:ke, the island of Montreal, in 1620, called Indigenous people a society without police. And of course, they didn't mean police departments or cops because those didn't exist yet. They meant what the original term policing meant in French, which was an enforced social order. And so the settlers were going to see Indigenous people as people lacking a social order. And of course, they had their own social order. What they lacked was a European imposed order. But that meant that something that we could call policing was really integral to settling this place, dispossessing Indigenous people. And so between 1620, when French settlers first come to the island of Montreal, in 1865, when a formal police department was established, you have this kind of nascent policing apparatus, which involves a variety of things. You obviously have laws, you have a magistrate, basically a judge, and any citizen, meaning a white person who owns property and is a man, can report a criminal infraction to the magistrate, and a bailiff can go out and collect that person and bring them to trial. The laws, of course, reflect the white supremacist and classist social order. And so Indigenous people were pushed off the island in 1720 onto Jesuit missions, which are places of religious indoctrination that are the precursor to residential schools. Enslaved Black people, of which there were several hundred over about a 200-year period, are basically policed by all white people. Because they're enslaved as domestics. And so they're moving about the city, but their actions are being watched by all white people to ensure that they don't commit the ultimate crime of being free. If they actually did escape, of course, as Charmaine Nelson's work has shown, white people are essentially deputized to return that enslaved person to their enslaver. And then you have a whole series of laws that are meant to criminalize the lives of poor people or just lower status people. You can't quite call them like working class people in the 1700s, but you have tavern laws that are meant to criminalize alcohol and its role in the leisure life of poor people. You have a bunch of laws against sex work, which of course police actual sex workers, but just also a lot of poor women who might be out unaccompanied at night. And the military has a patrol beginning at 9 o'clock every night, long before there was ever a police department. So all of the things that we associate with policing today are really there from the get-go, even before there's a police department. I guess we can talk about a kind of second phase where after 1865, there's a police department. From then into the present, you have a lot more police violence, you have a lot more police corruption. In the 60s, when the left Québécois nationalist movement was very strong, there are several nights referred to as Nuit de la Matraque, where the police would just go in and beat the crap out of Québécois activists in parks, at protests, and make hundreds and hundreds of arrests. Through the 70s and 80s, the police are raiding gay cruising spots and gay dances and sort of underground gay clubs. There are several major events like that, including a major raid on Sex Garage in 1990, where the police are just going in and arresting and beating everybody. And then, as the population shifts from a majority white, overwhelmingly white society to a more diverse society with changes in immigration laws, you have an increase of a kind of white supremacist policing that existed all along, but it's going to be practiced on a wider scale now because you just have a larger population. And so the first major protest against anti-Black policing happened in 1979 when the police beat the crap out of a bunch of Haitian youth playing soccer in a white neighborhood. Some old white neighbors called the police saying that youth were making too much noise. And I guess with running out of time is to say that, people have resisted the police the whole time. And some of that history we just can't ever, recover because it wasn't written down. But you have, organized public protests against the police going back to the 70s, where people are demanding something that looks like defunding the police. Not quite abolition, but people are demanding, that the police get out of their neighborhoods, that people can, keep themselves safe. And people have been publicly demanding a massive reduction in the police budget as early as like 5 years ago. And so in 2020, when the Defund the Police Coalition was created, which now brings together 80 groups in Montreal, it was carrying forward this long tradition of struggle that believes that the police are not necessary, they're not desirable. If we want to keep each other safe, there are a whole bunch of things we should be doing. And if we want funding for that, we know where to get it.
Thank you, Ted. I'm actually not going to ask you a question because I think that was quite comprehensive and a really good overview of a lot of these histories and how they're located. So I'm actually going to leave it there. That's not because I don't think you were interesting. Don't feel like I'm not asking you a question. I think that was very comprehensive. So thank you, Ted. And thank you as well for this chapter. So
thanks everyone. Thanks everyone who contributed. It's a real honor to be here with all these people who've inspired me and have inspired, a lot of organizers here in Montreal.
So that is from the chapter, which is chapter 4, Defund to Abolish, a 400-year struggle against policing in Montreal. Thank you so much, Ted. And Desmond, you're going to introduce the next group.
Thank you, Ted. I think that the perspective on how long these struggles in one form or another have been happening, even if we didn't always use the same language that we're using today. The next chapter that we would like to spotlight is by Edward Hansing Wong and Craig Fortier, who are authors with MJ Ringmena and Nicole Pennick. Their chapter 17, is called Abolishing Carceral Social Work. So Edward and Craig are both here with us. Good evening. Thank you so much for your contribution to the book. And please grace us with a little bit of a summary of what you were looking at.
Good evening, everyone. Real honor to be here. So yeah, my name's Edward. I have short black hair, lighter skin tone, second Hong Konger today. Wearing a white shirt, 2 pieces of artwork behind me with Chinese characters. This says Flow from the Lausanne Collective, which I'm a member of. So when I think Nicole, MJ, Craig, and I first began engaging with social work abolition, these concepts years ago, we found there was really little discussion of this within the sector. That's not to say abolitionist perspectives on social work is new. I mean, certainly these perspectives have always been present in communities and among service users, even if not always articulated in that way. But I think with all of the mass protests around racist police violence in Canada and the US, but also across the globe from Hong Kong to Chile, we really have seen these issues being forced, right? And pushing institutions to respond to these ideas for better or worse, and opening the doors to have these conversations today. But speaking of better or worse, I mean, how the social service sector has responded to these protests has been an attempt at appropriation. So, for example, I have a background in the mental health field. And this is where some of the loudest calls to replace cops with mental health workers have come from. These calls are very problematic, though, in that it ignores the fact that social workers themselves are perpetrators of violence. We in the mental health field are already in heavy collaboration with the police, whether it's to apprehend people for involuntary hospitalization, helping the surveillance of poorer communities through situation tables. And all this, of course, is a continuation of a long history of involvement in everything from forced sterilization of Indigenous people, the incarceration or deportation of Chinese workers for speaking Cantonese, and just countless examples. So we felt with our chapter, firstly, that really important to acknowledge how many social work careers have been built on the suffering of BIPOC communities, but also to fight for something different. I'll pass it along to Craig now.
Yeah, so first of all, just to introduce myself, my name's Craig. I am a white person. I am in a dingy basement. It is kind of dark and there are random things piled up. I am wearing a great ball cap that you can get to support the Prisoner Right Project in Toronto that says defund and abolish, and it has a police car with flower that is totally destroyed and has flowers growing through it. So definitely try and find it online or pick it up. I have a white sweatshirt on that has a logo for Barty Strange, who's a musician who I really enjoy. So as Edward was saying, I really think our chapter was grappling with this sort of duality. And this is a duality that we talked about a lot in our conversations about the chapter. One is that we know there are a ton of folks who are practicing social workers who are attempting to practice with an abolitionist framework, that they are trying to, and I'm going to quote the great Chanel Gallant, who's already spoken, to recognize that the best social worker, the only good social worker, is a criminal social worker, one that is going to defy the law, that is going to work and build in community, that is going to fight against the systemic violence that people face. At the other hand, we talk about this idea of like, we can't be abolitionist social workers without understanding that social work itself is part of a long-standing carceral institution, right? And in a previous piece that Edward and I had written called The Settler Colonialism of Social Work and the Social Work of Settler Colonialism, we actually talk about the history of the Indian agent on reservations. And when Canada was phasing out the Indian agent, it was the social work professional social work bodies that kind of lifted up their hand and stepped in and said, we'll deal with this sort of gap in containment, and took over. And that transition took place at about the time where residential schools were closing and the 60s scoop was beginning, right? And so there is a clear lineage between the role of social workers and the carceral and colonial apparatus of the state. And so for us, it's important not just to say we need to support abolitionists doing social work in community, but also understand that if we are practicing a principled abolitionism, we need to also target the profession of social work, that it needs to also be abolished, and we also need to fight for the support and funding of grassroots community-based mutual aid efforts, which are at the root of the politics that we want to bring about. And so I'm going to leave it at that, but that is sort of the nutshell of our chapter. And I do want to plug that BTL is going to be publishing a book called Abolition, Social Work Abolition in the near future. And that's what we've been working on as well.
We very much look forward to that. Thank you, Craig. Edward, let me go back to you for a really quick follow-up here. I'm very interested in this idea that lately the police have been telling us that they are actually being asked to be social workers and that therefore we must increase their budgets because they must respond as social workers to the kinds of calls that they think a social worker would do. I was at a police or a TTC, a transit meeting today where they were saying that special constables are receiving this social work type training. What do you make of this move by police to say, because we are stand-ins for social workers, you need to give us the requisite training, funding, etc., to be able to do that work.
Well, I mean, this is another example, I think, of how insidious it is. These institutions appropriates kind of the discontent and turns as a way to get more resources. And by the way, social workers, of course, are a big part of that too, in terms of we're often called to provide this training, right? It's just really problematic. It's again a framing of I think the term compassionate policing comes up sometimes when the fundamental violence of police work is still there. I mean, people are still being coerced. This is just again another reframing, a continuation of all the carceral violence we've been so critical of.
Well, we're looking forward to reading both your chapter and your upcoming work with BTL. Thank you both so much for being with us this evening, and I'll turn it back to Elle.
Thank you. And through this first half of speakers, what we've seen is how so many of these chapters are also in conversation with each other. We've heard a lot about different forms of carceral care, the different ways that policing, of course, isn't just the boys in blue on the street, but takes place in many institutions. And we're seeing how so many of these chapters build on those ideas together in conversation. We are now going to a poetry break. So this is very, very exciting. So we have spoken word poet Shima Robinson with us, and this is a poet whose work is based in grassroots organizing as well. So Shima Aisha Robinson is an Amiswachi Waskagan poet, that's Edmonton Treaty 6, and spoken word artist who embodies with every poem and pursuit the ancient meaning of her chosen pen name. I'm sorry, I might get this wrong. Dwenemen is the name of an ancient African Adrinka symbol, which means strength, humility, learning, and wisdom. So please welcome to the stage, Shima Robinson.
Hello, hello. Thank you for the introduction. I will make my little banter brief. I am, of course, Shima Robinson, aka Dwenemen. I am wearing a maroon and polka dotted, so not polka dotted, but patterned headscarf. I'm wearing glasses now that are clear framed. I am wearing a large black sweater with a large black vest over top of the large black sweater to keep me warm on this very cold Amiswachi Waskagan day. And and behind me there is a wall with printed wallpaper on it that is modeled after newsprint, and a door. Okay, I have 2 pieces to share today. The first is called Underbelly of an Origin Story. Both of these pieces engage with decolonial logics and address some of the many, many thoughts I've had about decolonizing and abolishing carceral and other colonial projects. So Underbelly of an Origin Story goes like this. It was those bloody royals who sent the officers of deceit to ride us down and split our families from their trees. Those blue sanguine who laid us low in row upon row of anguished soul, counted our severed heads, bowed under the guise of loyalty at the behest of the crown, flown into our home in the fell form of overbold bullets spit to turn the bones of my people to cracked sediment and stone. Even as we worked our straight backs into the curved furrows of the land, plodded slow, stood merciless against our own whipping syllables, that glanced off neighboring shoulders, braced to bear the weight of brazen whispers, tended by elders' ghosts in the embers of Africa, ablaze, dismembered, disfigured, dismayed, yet close. Emboldened by our laborers' language, syllables that survived the awkward coming out of the word labrish from my pride open mouth that had wrapped itself around that Jamaican term for local tongues. The sum of a lost record that clung to the hearts and shouts of the intrepid one people. My pen began the end of my longest known drought as I inked the crooked shadow of the wan steeple. I've wrested, swallowed, and bested the pointed doubt that severed the hallowed heads of my ancient family from the deeply held meaning of my eventual dowry, altering the currency from the pound to our freedom's challenge. Of those sickly abhorrent assumptions they brought us each time they claimed to have bought us as though we never deserved a home. The jewels that kept as reminders of the richness of our lands became emblematic of the cold clench of Elizabethan hands, burdened by the turning of our skulls, and clammy Shakespearean palms withholding alms so affably calm in the still of the gilts. While our matriarchal warlord Nanny of the Maroons had us heated in the pursuit, up steep slopes, past deadly sinkholes, through impassable lands, she ran a freedom circuit into the rock and grit of the cockpit country. Dangerous effrontery, the fastest known to woman, tracking the soot of destroyed slaveholdings, merciless, on foot, glowing. So we still bolt for that glory and scream fire into the dim resting threat of our royal prospects. We climb to the freedom of vantage bestowed by empire, holding down our own tongues, speaking the healing names of our long lost children, progeny of the fury of that falsehood of flood, that voyage over oceans that still hold spirits of our heroes in the throes of righteousness, awash in a legacy of blood. Yeah, that's the first one. The first piece, which basically tells a story about Jamaica. Thank you, Al. Tells a story about Jamaica, the people in Jamaica. Oh, we have the applause. And my particular connection to conviction about what that history means to me personally, as my parentage is Jamaican. Now I have a second poem. This one is called Landing, and it goes like this. There is a place in my heart that has been too painful to mention. A known rule from home, it will moan to me as I speak to you in tones. On the edge of the threshold where the water is cursed, doors closed on the heads of the damned near immersed, in the swelter of the scene of the blister unburst, the chattel of fell design concealed glints of sunburst. Thrust their bodies into the abandon of would-be truths denied, abused, discarded, and decried, bound in the bloodthirsty roiling of a continental lie, saw their ancestors fly into the storm of their own shuttering eyes, concealing the heat of ore, in rage red smolder, groaning in its warp, they kept the calm of resign and the passion of rebellion, giving nuclei to atomic creations, coaxing bone memory from Atlantic skeletons, the seat of the souls of nations, risen in the form of children born only to die. Living on in a brandished, blanched lie, we took on the heat of the cauldron of sear and hiss. We drink deeply now, down to our bones, and by the dint in our wrists, turn the gestures of livelihood into signs of a stylish diss. Smiling with teeth made of enamel formed in the molten armor of our ancestors' marrow, whose captive entanglement was chained to the vile, sonorant lie of a low origin in the burr brambles of mere moment upon moment, upon moment, upon moment, until it became time for us to realize that we are the stolen who found a home within open stride, in the rise of distant tides that call our eyes to dizzying rounds, that allow the scope and breadth for the drumming up of a calculated guess at what made that message we acknowledge with that fondness on our lips and caution in our fingertips. Each time another rebel bleeds hello, smiling through reddened teeth, to keep hell beneath us, questioning its realness for the dignity of lurid uttered curses administered as curatives pulled from the sticks we picked out of the onslaught, to remind us of the customs made us save the world we've wrought under the tutelage of our mother's uterine nurture, Her voice is reverberating through the fluid purpose turned to wind as we raised our blessed heads to the din of industry and the sordid contortions of our love of land. Her molten tones that consumed all of our bronzed arrogance and smelted our iron metal to be folded into the alchemy of our older luster that cloaks our newer customs until we cluster our complaints at the footsteps of our elders, and we've wept for their remembrance, for we have grown to know what they had been told to name as golden, the solstice, the passage of seasons, and the landing of our feet from Ari drifts into the fume of cooling pits that keep charcoal in the springtime and fire in the winter, heat flung of a hearthstone that spits, so we could bask in their back-raised, brazen, protective rage, chasing the minions of the masters of none over the cliffs of our gods, who eschew the words some of us now use for them, and reduce our slavering enemies to lovable earth, petrified in its birth. Nurtured by our thirst, we seek water and curse what errs in our hearts for calling the cold, stainless tap of that metronome of lack our benefactor, drinking deeply of disaster to decipher its craft and unmake its math, even as it leaves us running over broken land, tongues uncracked, my proud heaving chest, my eyes, my yes man behest, less agreement than imperative pressure, my sachet and salute to the way my mother still walks defiantly past the tyrant screams built into the dreams of every immigrant queen, of every common castle built with uncommon hustle, lunging toward the affront of danger with billow and blaze that burn lasting warning into her children, who gather and rally to back down disaster at the sound of her grave, deepening laughter that buried Babel to the rafters, time and time again, built this friend. So for my first friend, so I'll follow in her footsteps and track those of our people further back than the unholy steeple and the blasphemous flail. I'm a child of a war, a lover of raw strength worked into supple sound, the voices in the round that are guided by stars and ruled only by a broken conch that lost the wail of the ocean's want, that had crested its foam and froth over the wrath of our brutal crossing, that cannot softly sing another echo into the ears of the desperate bent over their own withdrawn affluence, starved for the sound of landing passage that will summon marrow to mourn in the birth of new words for known, that can have us all speak new words for home. C'est tout. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shima. And can we give it up in the chat? I was looking through reaction and I couldn't find it. So let's give it up for Shima in the chat and show the love. It's not easy to be on this Zoom selling poetry that deep, that emotional, with that much history, with that much power on a Zoom. So let's really give it up to that performance. That was beautiful. And of course, Abolition is so grounded in Black feminist voices in all their forms. So we're so grateful that you shared that with us tonight. That was fire. We're honored. Thank you so much. Do you have anything else coming out before we let you go?
Yeah, actually, I have a chapbook being published by Glasshouse Press that will be available hopefully by the end of April. And it includes that poem. So
okay, so can we get the name of that in the chat for people? So
yeah, I'll drop it in the chat. It's called the Bellow Project. Well, the project is called the Bellow Project, which is an album with all the poetry in it, and then the book is called Bellow, and I'll put it all in the chat. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for blessing us with that. Thank you. We're coming towards the end. We're past halfway. We have about 4 more chapters to get through in case people are orienting themselves in the evening. So please do hang with us. We're a little slow, but we're okay for time. So we're going to just keep pushing. Desmond's going to introduce the next group.
Thank you so much, Shima. You said raw strength worked into supple sound. It is such a pleasure to get to hear you. I got to hear Shima in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago doing poetry live. We're so, so grateful for your contribution this evening. Thank you so much. Chanel mentioned earlier that this is a collection that doesn't just have a token mention or contribution regarding sex work, but that is actually using it in several chapters, the next of which we're going to feature here. Ali Adicure and Jenny Duffy, both with Maggie's Toronto, are co-authors of chapter 12 of the collection, which is Sex Worker Justice by Us, for Us, Toronto Sex Workers Resisting Carceral Violence. We would like to welcome Ellie and Jenny this evening. Thank you so much for being with us. And please begin by giving us a summary of your work in this collection. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us tonight. So I'll give a description of myself to start. So I'm a white girl with glasses, blonde hair, black sweatshirt. I'm also holding our book. I'm so proud of it. I'm standing in front of a boring white wall. So I'm very pleased to talk about our chapter tonight that I had the pleasure of co-authoring with my colleague, Ellie Adker, on behalf of Maggie's Toronto Sex Workers Action Project. I'm also just going to give a light summary, kind of like a lame lamb, because I also want to echo that message to buy this book, read it, absorb its message, and really sit with the stories and ideas that are coming in here. So in our chapter, we spent time discussing the ways that policing manifests in the sex work community. And it manifests in very different ways. Some ways it's very visible, like for street working sex workers who are fined, ticketed, harassed for loitering and whatever police can come up with. And then there's also policing that takes place behind closed doors as well, during raids, like the human trafficking raids that Elaine spoke of earlier. And also, something that we've seen at Maggie's, especially during COVID-19, though it's not anything new, is police pretending to be clients, booking sex workers, showing up, and then arresting them or ticketing them on the spot. So all these really traumatic experiences. And we continue to see the explicit targeting over surveillance of sex workers. And it's really important to recognize that looks different and its impact is felt in so many different ways. Like while sex work is criminalized, the impact of the criminalization looks very different. We know that Black, racialized, Indigenous, trans, queer, disabled sex workers are targeted disproportionately and are subject to police violence. And so we continue to call for the decriminalization of sex work, and we call for the justice of sex work as we realize all the different laws that need to be changed, and that criminalization needs to be completely removed, and that we also need to uphold all of our struggles for human rights. We need to uphold the struggle for abolition, uphold the struggle for racial justice, for prisoners' rights, rights for drug users, that all of this is together in the struggle for sex worker justice. So it's not even just about decriminalization. That's an important first step, but there's so much that impacts our communities. And something that we discussed in our chapter is a very important piece of Maggie's history, but we're also very sad that it's a piece of our history, which was the disappearance of our friend and our community member, Laura Wells, in 2017. So as many of you know, Laura Wells went missing all of a sudden, and the police laughed at and dismissed her case when her father came forward and wanting to put forward a missing persons file. And, police said, people like this disappear all the time. They are transient. So police, they dragged their heels, they laughed in our faces because Laura Wells had a background in sex work, because she was racialized, because she was trans, because she was navigating homelessness as well. And our chapter talks about the amazing leadership of Monica Forrester and the colleagues at Maggie's in forming search parties and really getting this case onto media attention, and finally getting the police to do something. And we highlight how sex workers are both targeted by police and also not helped by police. So while sex workers are going through these awful experiences and grieving for people in their community, they're also, our communities also need to be the ones to step up and try and get justice ourselves and search for our family and our friends ourselves. So this is a story that we highlight, as another grave example of the failure of police and the strength of our collective power as sex work community to join together and to take care of each other as well. And last thing I want to say before handing it over to my colleague Ellie is that sex workers have been on the forefront of activism since the beginning of time. And, we can think of a more recent example in the Stonewall uprisings. And there's such a rich history of sex workers being on the forefront of movements like abolition and anti-colonialism. And so it's encouraging, to see this addition where there are sex work groups, and sex workers really need to be included in these conversations and given space to speak of their struggle, because this is just the experience of sex workers constantly being targeted and surveilled. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ellie.
Yeah, there's so much to talk about, but maybe the easiest thing is to we'll try and summarize, but definitely read the full chapter. My name is Ellie Adeker. To describe my background, I am sitting here in front of a bookcase that has too many books on it that I haven't read but still continue to buy for some reason. I'm wearing a multicolored sweater that's blue, white, and red. Beauty is a social construct, but I'm very pretty and a light-skinned Black woman. And I've been with Maggie's for a number of years now, and was part of and helped organize the search parties for Alora Wells. They're really trying to write the chapter out was very difficult because it's really difficult to put into words what it feels like to literally comb a riverbank and hilly, bushy area trying to find someone who has gone missing, that the police won't look for, that communities outside of sex working communities won't acknowledge has disappeared. There really is this sense of when violence happens against sex workers, it's sex workers and sex worker justice organizations that are tasked with responding. And I think that a lot of the conversation tonight about how carceral frameworks are very clear within policing and the criminal justice system and extend out into areas of social work and education are very important. I also think it's really important that we name the fact that those same carceral politics and frameworks and that same distancing and suppressing of sex worker voices and leaderships also thrives in local activism and in local organizing spaces as well. And so that's one reason why I'm excited that there are so many sex worker groups and organizations talking about their contributions to this volume today, but also just something that, I would hope that people watching, if you are involved in social movement work, if you are involved in local organizing and local activism, it's really important to interrogate how your organizations and how your movements speak to and about and address sex workers, because it is the same forms of carceral politics, the same forms of policing, the same forms of suspicion and distancing and the rumor mill that ends up pushing sex workers out of movements that we are so fundamental in organizing for. And when Jenny talks about sex workers being central to social movements, we are talking across the board, abolitionist movements, Black liberation movements for queer and trans justice, movements that sex working communities, specifically Black sex workers, specifically Black trans sex workers have birthed, and yet continue to be separated from and continue to be isolated and ostracized from organizing and progressive movements that don't interact and don't engage with sex work as a valid movement for social justice and for human rights. And so I think that would be, in terms of practical things that I hope folks will take from our submission around the impact of criminalization and policing in terms of the direct violence, in terms of the erasure that a lot of sex workers experience. Obviously buy the book, read the chapters, there's a lot of great submissions, but also beyond any of that, I really hope that the stories and the experiences of struggle and complete devastation, because when we were doing those search parties, it's such a difficult thing. There are no words to describe what it feels like to do that and how traumatizing it is. And yet every single time when violence happens to sex workers, when sex workers are pushed out of social movement spaces, when we're exposed to the same forms of policing and criminalization, the victim blaming, the slut shaming, the pathologizing, having our intimate physical sexual history sort of laid out in activist spaces not just within policing, not just within social work, but within your progressive departments, within your progressive organizations, within your progressive movements. That's an extension of those same carceral frameworks. And we are all responsible for doing something about that. So I hope you read the chapter. Thank you so much for your time and for the space to talk today. You can follow Maggie's online at maggiesto.org. Butterfly is also a wonderful organization. I know I don't think the Sex Workers of Winnipeg Action Coalition are here, but they're doing really fantastic work out in the prairies as well. So please also give them a follow. And please, yeah, I hope that some of what we've shared today, and I hope that some of what's in our chapter helps build better and more inclusive and less carceral movements. Thanks.
Thank you so much to both of you. And Ellie, let me just ask you a quick follow-up. Gloria Epstein, the retired justice, did a missing persons report where she said that she spoke to a lot of sex workers and that this had a big impact on her in terms of things that she didn't understand about sex work. And nevertheless, in her report, she said that she didn't want to use the term defunding because she wanted to give the police an opportunity to essentially make amends for some of the harm that they had done in the community. And as somebody who's been so close to this issue, I wonder what you might say for those who are hesitant to use the more forceful language of defunding and abolition because they think that some kind of a reformist tone is the more pragmatic or realistic tone to take right now.
Okay, apologies in advance because I might cry because I remember this report and when it came out, and the justice in that case cited her experience at Maggie's quite a bit to justify those views, and specifically coming to a drop-in. I think she came once or maybe twice for a few hours and talked to people in the downtown east about the kind of policing that they were experiencing. I don't know what to say to people that think about using strategic or pragmatic language and not talking about abolition in explicit terms, beyond the fact that sex workers in our community are being being brutalized, absolutely brutalized, by the police, by the criminal justice system, by perpetrators of violence that understand that those systems work in their favor, and will disappear sex workers and blame sex workers and shame sex workers. And I think that the case that we talk about in the chapter around Alora and the search parties and that organizing that we had to do because nobody else would do it. Nobody else would have done it. Who would have organized those search parties? Who would have done that searching around had it not been for people at Maggie's, had it not been for Monica Forrester, had it not been for people on the ground that said to Toronto police that it wasn't acceptable to just refuse to open the case, and that it wasn't acceptable that people like this disappear and reappear all the time. I think that the discussion around wanting to use more pragmatic and strategic language is actually quite similar to some of the violence that sex workers experience in social movement spaces and in activist spaces, where we have to sort of balance the idea of well, if we're organizing for Black liberation, it might actually alienate some of our audiences if we're talking about queer and trans street-based sex workers. And so we're not actually going to include those voices in our organizing. And we think that they're a little suspicious, and we don't want to talk about drug users, and we don't want to talk about people who sell and exchange sexual services. And we're not going to talk about young people in these contexts as well, because those things just seem like gray areas. And I think that, for more liberal audiences that are engaging with this language for the first time, I understand how that can be a very intimidating thing to think about abolition or in that context. But what sex workers are experiencing right now is so much worse. It's so much worse. There's so much more at stake for people in our communities. And I think without very intentional, without very far-reaching movements for abolition to resist police violence, we're effectively being left to die, and we are being disappeared. And people will not look for us when we go missing because people like us disappear and reappear all the time. And I just I really just want people listening in. I want not my co-op, but everyone here that submitted to also really think about what's at stake in sex worker organizing when it's our friends that are going missing, and our friends who are being killed, and our friends who are being booked and sexually assaulted and targeted and stalked and harassed and raped and fined by police and then blamed because of the nature of the work. that sex workers engage in. It's so unacceptable. It's so unacceptable. It's so violent. And by refusing to engage with abolitionist frameworks, by like refusing to engage with and support sex workers in our movement spaces, it's only co-signing that violence. That's all it is. And so I just like people, you just need to get brave. You need to get brave because like we've been stepping up for our friends disappearing and being murdered from time, and we need your help.
Thank you so much, Ellie. You're getting a lot of reaction to that in the chat.
Yeah, you set the chat on fire.
Yeah.
We want to thank both of you for your contributions to this book. Thank you for speaking about difficult subjects. And we really encourage everybody to read not just the chapter of the book, not just buy the whole book, but to follow Maggie's and to follow the other sex work organizations that are being posted in the chat as we speak to support the advocacy that's going on.
So that chapter is called Sex Worker Justice, By Us, For Us, Toronto Sex Workers Resisting Carceral Violence. We have 3 more chapters that we're covering for people. I know we're running a little behind. We do ask people if you can hang with us. You can, you're not on camera, you can go get a drink together or something and still keep listening if you have plans, but we're almost done. So we have 3 more, and I'm going to introduce now Vicky Chartrand. Also, you should check out the Abolition syllabus in so-called Canada, a project that has been organized by Vicky and others that really gives an overview of a lot of the literature and work that is out there. So you can find that on, I think, noprisons.ca, but Vicky is with the Unearthing Justices Project and the author of a chapter called Grassroots Justices, Lessons from Communities of Murdered and Disappeared Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People. Welcome, Vicky. And could you give us a bit of an overview of your chapter and the work that's involved in it?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ellen. I can't take credit for the syllabus. There were so many bright minds involved in that. And it's so nice to be surrounded by such incredible presence. But I'm a white woman with long brown hair, brown eyes. I'm pretty plain looking, but I have a spectacular blue tree behind me. And I have a bright 5-year-old daughter who grows me more than I grow her. And beside me, I'm overlooking the beautiful, unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Abenaki people. So actually, Ellen and I were on a panel earlier in the year, and I was mentioning to her that I often come to abolition from an anti-violence perspective. And so whether that's interpersonal violence or violence, institutional violence we see in the prison, and racialized violence, but I also do some work, and for quite some time now, some collaborating, organizing with the families and communities of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And over those years and the time I've been doing that, what I've witnessed was, not only are the families and communities calling for justice, in the face of the neglect and absence of justice, if the criminal justice is not actually invasive and violent, as Ellie and Jenny were so clearly pointing out, but they've actually also been cultivating justice through resources of support and constellations of resource and support, and also by building intentional relations. So I'm part of this Unearthing Justice project that Elle mentioned. I'm just going to put it up in the discussion, or the chat. And part of it was we did a cross-country road trip talking to Indigenous going on communities and reserves, talking to folks. And we also did a national media scan where we collected well over 500 initiatives that were done for the murders and disappearances. And they were all Indigenous-led, Indigenous-based. And they were ranged from anything from raising awareness and public education, literary activism, caregiving, coalition building, community patrols, healing circles, remembering, witnessing, and search support, among many other things. And so not only do these resources show us the vast skill and strengths that already exist in Indigenous communities, but they actually reflect the many facets of what justice is and what it needs. And I think well beyond the imaginaries of what a state or a criminal justice can actually imagine. And so just to give you a quick example, so, the police have this mono function of solving cases, and their work's narrowly drawn around, finding perps and building evidence and getting clearance rates. But and families were finding themselves caught in this policing function where they're segregated from each other. They were removed from the actual investigation and finding their loved ones, and they'd be struggling against this policing functions to try to keep the policing cases alive. And so the grassroots would come together, on the other hand, to recognize immediate needs of not simply solving cases, but actually building constellations of support. So in a way that connects families and brings them together and builds community. So this was evident, for example, in Drag the Red initiative, where volunteers came together to drag the Red River in Winnipeg after a young Indigenous girl's body was found in the river, and police refused to drag the river any further, stating it was ineffective and too inefficient, or in other words, costly. And so they took it upon themselves. They pooled their resources together. They brought community members together. They dragged the Red. And in addition to dragging the Red, they also built missing persons toolkits to help families navigate the media, built how to navigate or how to build investigations and log communications, and just various ways to carry out searches. And that's just one example. I could go on and give you more examples, like the woman in Portage la Prairie, who offers a safe passage to women as they're crossing the highways. There's the Sister Watch in the downtown East Side that does wraparound services for the Indigenous women. So there's such incredible community support that's done on the backs of the communities themselves, on their own time, in their own resources. And we often think, how it's hard to imagine a world without police or a criminal justice system. But when you go into these communities, not only is it possible, that is their existence, because when the police do intervene or the criminal justice does intervene, it's usually in an evasive and violent way. And so I think in a lot of times in abolition, we spend a lot of times, I know I speak on my own behalf, we spend a lot of times fighting the system, but I think, it was really important for me to take a chapter from the folks that I was working with, where we are actually cultivating each other and cultivating justice, not in some ideal form, which, that abolitionists always get accused of, but actually in real terms, like right now, that's happening, that's going on right now. Yeah. So thanks for having me hear me out.
What I really enjoy about that is we've been hearing a lot through the night about these carceral feminist structures, often social workers, not always, but often social workers are white women, of course. We're talking about anti-trafficking abolitionists, the other kind of abolitionists that engage in carceral systems. So maybe just to follow up on that, it sounds like your chapter is very grounded in the work of Indigenous feminists and Indigenous women. Could you speak a little bit about it? And this is why I also brought up the syllabus a bit, because one of the things we see is that things aren't always named as abolition. They're not always part of the movement, but we know that work is so much of what is actually influencing this work, whether or not you call yourself an abolitionist or not. So could you talk a bit maybe about that grassroots energy and spirit and work that is actually driving a lot of this organizing?
Yeah, super good point. And I think because Ellie was talking about how, sex workers are central to the movement. And I think that the grassroots and the Indigenous grassroots are central to the movement too. And it's like Ellie pointed out, like the folks themselves, they often may be punitive and for right reasons. They haven't had justice. They don't see justice at all in any kind of shape and form from the system itself. And so they call for justice, but their work is actually emulates or kind of reflects a sort of very, very much so these kinds of abolitionist principles. And I'll give you, I like to tell it in examples and to ground it in something, but on our trip, we'd go through cities and towns gassing up, and I was with Gladys Raddick, who's Gitsan Wet'suwet'en and grassroots activist, and she would have her war pony, which was a car, and she'd get permissions from the families to post pictures of the missing women on her car. And as we drive through the communities, people would stare in a very voyeuristic way, right? And maybe ask a question or two. But it wasn't until we get on reserve or Indigenous communities, we get out of the car and people would gather around the car. They would shake Gladys's hand and thank her for all the work she was doing. They would talk to all the pictures. They would talk to some of the pictures. They'd share some of their own experiences, and help help try to connect the families down the road. And they would also offer us free food, free lodging, free gas, right? And I think those are basic abolitionist tenets and principles by which not that they automatically live in, they don't have to study it like I had to, going in through my undergrad and the like. So yeah, a really important point, Alan. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Thank you so much, Vicky. That is all the time we have. So that is Vicky Chartrand. Her chapter is called Grassroots Justices, Lessons from Communities of Murdered and Disappeared Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit People. Thank you so much. We have 2 more chapters. We're almost there. Everybody just hang with us. Desmond, you're going to introduce the next chapter.
Thank you, Elle. Thank you, Vicky. I wanted to actually bring in a comment in the chat from Kim Jackson, who says, I think it's really important that there are folks with lived experience in this volume. It feels important to also identify, how those who do not have lived expertise come to this work. So I just wanted to share that as a perspective in everything that we're hearing from people, and in some of the gratitude and some of the reflection from people who are listening to you right now. We would like to introduce at this point Ryan Hayes. Ryan is the author of Chapter 6, a very intriguing chapter called Let's Talk About Police in Our Unions. And I am very, very interested to hear from Ryan this evening about why you thought it was an important contribution to this collection, and what are your thoughts about the way that the union movement in Canada is engaging with, well, the most powerful union, some of the most powerful unions in Canada, which is law enforcement. Welcome, and thank you for being here, Ryan.
Thanks, Desmond. And I'm just in awe of everyone who's spoken already, and just want to share my, gratitude to everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Ryan Hayes. I'm coming to you from Toronto or Toronto. I'm a mixed Iranian and white male. In my background, you'll see some letters. You might be struggling to make it out. So it says, "Make the rich pay," and some artwork on the wall as well. I myself am a labor activist. And so my contribution was sort of picking up from this moment, the incredible uprisings in Canada, the United States, and in fact, around the world that followed the horrendous murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. In that moment, we saw some very bold statements come out from Canadian labor unions, sort of expressing their solidarity. But for me, and I think many others, it also raised a question about what this means for our unions themselves, and sort of looking internally and seeing how we're implicated in this question of policing and violence, when in fact there are many unions, as Desmond was starting to allude to, that also have police in their membership. And so one of the things that I sort of discuss in this article is sort of grounding in this question of who has the right to organize. Because there was a very significant case where for a number of years, the RCMP, who previously didn't have the right to form a union, were able to win that right. And there were actually some Canadian labor unions, including the Canadian Labor Congress, who intervened on their behalf and argued in favor of them having that right. While meanwhile, there are other workers, such as farm workers, migrant farm workers who primarily come from the Caribbean and from Mexico, who do not have that right. Tonight, we heard from a number of sex workers who are very much on the margins of the labor movement, in the sense that they aren't formally included in our central labor bodies. And so here you have a bit of a contradiction where, as a labor movement, we have very strong values of solidarity, but those aren't being fully expressed or enacted when it comes to primarily Black, Indigenous, and racialized workers who are concentrated in fields where they don't have the right to organize, or who in their day-to-day lives are the subjects of police violence and terror. So this is what I start to look at in this article. And there's a very interesting case that sort of is, I think, illustrative of this dynamic, which was following the RCP decision. One of the largest unions in Canada, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, announced what they called an organizing victory or breakthrough, because they organized 1,300 members of the RCMP Intelligence Intercept Monitoring Service. And this actually provoked a backlash within their own membership. And a group came together called Cops Out of CUPE that was started by Indigenous members of the union, people who had firsthand experience of police violence, who for them felt this was making them feel unsafe within their own union, and also questioning how CUPE, which itself is a union that has been targeted by the police, that has, like many other unions, had police enforce injunctions against their picket lines and break their strikes would turn around and spend what could have been millions of dollars on an organizing campaign to bring them into the fold of their union. And so this sort of opened up this conversation and raises other questions. What's at stake for the labor movement? There was a really interesting statistic from Correctional Services Canada, where they sort of bragged and said they're actually the largest employer of Indigenous people in the federal public service. And I sort of asked, how do we view this? Is this a win for employment equity and for, the growth of unions? Or is this a sort of a tragic waste of human potential when we think about it from an abolitionist perspective and the futures that we want to see for ourselves and our communities, how these resources could be better allocated, and how we could build a labor movement that is not just trying to grow its ranks, but is actually trying to build, as we often say, a more socially just society. And so when you look at these cases of people trying to raise these questions, unfortunately, they've been met with quite a cool response from the leadership of a number of these unions. And one of the reasons is this dynamic where unions are often on the sort of back foot. And unfortunately, in a context of capitalist austerity and racial capitalism, when you look at growth in employment sectors, it's actually the policing and carceral state that's one of the fastest growing sectors. And so it's sort of been increasingly a significant source of membership within trade unions. And in some cases has even had an outsized influence, because there's been some high profile cases where unions have actually competed with each other to say who's the best union to represent, for example, prison guards in the provincial or federal context. And there's been raids, again, millions of dollars being spent that could be used to organize new members, to defend our communities, to grow our labor and social justice movements, but is instead being spent for sort of civil war between unions to say, what's the best home for prison guards? And therefore you have union leaders saying things like build more prisons. And you even have a case where there was a union, a public sector union in Ontario, that took a grievance on behalf of prison guards for a jail in London, where over 13 people had died in the past 19 years. And family members of those who had passed put up a memorial across the street from the jail. And the prison guard union filed a grievance saying that the memorial was traumatizing the prison guards. And the prison guards took down that memorial without notifying the family members in advance. And when they were facing discipline, took it to a grievance and actually won. And so again, this sort of raises questions of, we know what our values are as a labor movement. It's time to live them. It's time to put them into practice. And that sometimes involves making difficult decisions about if we believe in racial justice, how we're actually forefronting that, and not just seeing the labor movement as a vehicle for growth into itself, but actually building a just society. And so maybe to just close with my remarks, there's been some really, I think, inspiring organizing that's come up sort of from the grassroots. And just to say a few, to acknowledge, for example, the Ontario Federation of Labour, in conjunction with the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists, has taken a very principled stand in support of defunding and has done educational events in support of that position, along with some labor councils like in Hamilton and Peel. And I think that's really important and principled work. And there's also been things like broader work, like getting police out of schools, where trade unionists have supported that effort. I think that's really crucial. And sort of campaigns like the Choosing Real Safety Declaration. A number of unions have stepped up to sign on to that declaration. And if there's any trade unionists here on this meeting tonight, I would encourage you to look into getting your union to support that if they haven't already. And maybe I'll leave it there for now. Thanks.
Ryan, thank you so much for this summary. I'm going to post in the chat a news report related to what you were talking about, and the headline is Memorial to Deceased Inmates, Too Raw for Correctional Officers. And I think you've really highlighted for us how we need to think about this idea of growing ranks within the union movement versus doing the kind of work that we all believe is emancipatory, and the role that the police play. I can remember years ago in Toronto, the police local division here in Toronto fighting against the minimum wage increase because they believed that such an increase was actually like harmful to the general coffers of the public, and this idea that police unions can never be in solidarity with the larger movement for our liberation. Ryan, thank you so much for your contribution to this collection. I encourage everybody to read this, and we appreciate you being with us here this evening.
Thank you so much. We are at our last speaker, which is also the first chapter. So that was Ryan with the chapter, Let's Talk About Police in Our Unions. And our final presenter speaker tonight is Jeffrey Monahan, author of chapter 1, which is Uphold the Right, Police, Conservatism, and White Supremacy. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Elle, and thank you. This has been an amazing event. I've learned so much, and I'm really looking forward to reading all of these chapters. So I'm very honored to be part of the collection and such a good event tonight. I'll just give a brief recap, or sorry, brief description of my screen. I'm a 40-some-year-old white guy with glasses and a mustache and a blurry Zoom background that's kind of hiding a messy room, and I have a black hoodie. And my chapter is called Uphold the Right. So I take it's in quotations, and I take that title from the motto of the RCMP, which is in the coat of arms of the RCMP, and it's actually in French. It says Maintiens le droit. And the English translation to that is Uphold the Right. And this, I kind of plucked this out of a great book from Jeff Sallet, which is a Globe and Mail journalist, that he wrote right after the Dirty Tricks campaign and the McDonald inquiry. And, you know, it was one of these first books by, you know, a public kind of, you know, important mainstream journalist to really take on the myth of the Mounties and this idea that the RCMP are this noble institution. And it was an important book because it did a lot for documenting not only the Dirty Tricks campaign, but really getting at this kind of dominant culture of policing and the image of cops and policing in the RCMP in Canada. So the chapter takes off from that starting point, and it kind of, it makes two interrelated points. It plays on this idea of uphold the right, and kind of underlining that Canada is a settler colonial society. It's a settler colonial society that's based off of principles of whiteness, whether that's individualism, whether that's property, whether that's consumerism, whether that's modes of civility or ways of behavior that are associated with whiteness and proper forms of conduct. That is settler colonialism. It's framed by whiteness, and upholding the right is upholding what are very dominant cultural norms and institutions in Canada. So it really kind of underlines that settler colonialism is a very conservative culture. It's based in conservative values. These are white values. And it's not just the white values of like the Pierre Poilievre rallies and the truckers or the neo-Nazis. These are dominant iterations and cultural norms in Canada that are based in and caked in to what we think of as belonging and citizenship and what Canada and Canadian is, and all of these, you know, really kind of dominant centrist ideas. So it's not just the far right. It's far more dominant that we need to kind of be really kind of deconstructing and challenging. And then the second point that's related to that is policing is mixed into this as well. Policing institutions are highly conservative. They are also defenders of very, and sometimes more explicit and more kind of vulgar and violent forms of settler colonial violence. And so the chapter picks up some of these great themes that Ryan and Desmond were just talking about police victimization, and how police victimization narratives are often used to really delegitimize criticisms of policing. And so the chapter kind of weaves in a little bit of how police have really framed their counterattacks on the gains that we've made in recent years that build off of a long legacy of struggles against policing, but how police victimization narratives are kind of weighing in on that. And it closes off really on that point, that we've made a lot of gains, but that policing institutions are very much hedged against us, and they have very prominent weapons and tactics to try and delegitimize our attempts to rein them in, abolish them, disarm them, and create a more just society. So it closes on the point that, you know, we need to keep in mind what policing organizations are, both their structure in terms of settler colonial institutions, but also their membership, and that these folks are also the people at the Pierre Polyev rallies and the trucker rallies and all that. So we have to keep that in mind, and that really closes off certain doors on reform as a strategy. It doesn't mean that reform as a tactic isn't quite useful when we can make use of it, but it really does close the door off to reform as a strategy. We really do have to do all the things that everyone today has been really underlining in terms of change, in terms of just the resilience we need in our movements to stay strong and keep working and keep doing the wonderful things that everyone is doing. So thank you very much for all of your work. And thank you very much to the organizers and the editors of the book, Sherry, Kevin, Abby, and Between the Lines. Thank you so much for putting it out because it's really useful. It's great stuff. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I have one quick question to you, just to end. Could you talk about the right appropriation of the word freedom? You did this to yourself by mentioning the Freedom Convoy. So could you maybe, to end us off, talk about how the right uses freedom versus the kind of freedom that abolitionists envision?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think that, it's quite frustrating to see people who have so much white privilege and white entitlement to yell freedom when you've spent so much time kind of seeing freedom struggles from Black liberation struggles, Indigenous struggles, queer struggles, sex worker struggles that are really talking about freedom from very specific forms of specific violence and historical violence and historical injustice. So it's very frustrating to see these are very different iterations of freedom. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you. So we are at the end of the presentation. I know there was a question in the chat, but we are over time. I don't know, Desmond, if maybe I'll throw it to you. The question was basically about how do we prevent these movements from being co-opted. So maybe you want to say something quick about that, and then we'll close the night down.
Yeah, I did see that. I've seen a lot of the remarks and questions in the chat, and we thank everybody. We're sorry for the limited time frame that we're working within. All I can say about co-optation being put on the spot here is that we have to actually, I think, go back to what is it that we're trying to do? What is it that we want to accomplish? Are we trying to get people in power to mouth the platitudes that will make us feel reassured, that will make us feel like someone maybe in institutional authority is listening to us? Or do we actually want a substantive change of how systems work? Are we dreaming beyond the things that exist right now? Or are we simply asking for what we think people in positions of authority will allow us to demand today? I don't have a full answer to this question, but I think that the work is always about pushing the boundaries of respectability. Ellie mentioned this. Several people have mentioned this evening. It's about pushing the boundaries and dreaming beyond, as I see somebody saying in the comments right now, what we're allowed to think is possible. And so I think everybody needs to read this book. You can go out and find this book. I was taking notes this evening. We've heard about settler colonialism. We've heard about the importance of sex workers and the central contribution that sex workers are making to our larger movements, while often actually not being recognized for those contributions. We've heard about the dangers of social work as a presumed alternative to carceral systems, which is actually part of the carceral system that we can't be fooled into believing. We've talked about prison organizing and the life-saving work that people are doing behind bars while they are incarcerated to make new things possible for us. We've heard about the problems of the union movements and their complicity with police and the long history of the defund and abolition struggle. We really encourage everybody, whatever ways you can find this collection, wherever you shop for your books, please order or go out today and pick up a copy of this wonderful, wonderful collection, Disarm, Defund, Dismantle, and follow the work critically of the organizations that you've heard from this evening, because everybody continues to do work where they live and to try and collectively plug in to the broader struggle in so-called Canada for our liberation.
So that does bring us to the end of the evening. If we can bring everybody who is available, just come on screen so you can wave at everybody and we can clap everybody for your amazing work, for your amazing contributions tonight. Congratulations, everybody, on this book. It's been an honor being here with you tonight. What a beautiful evening. Thank you to everybody in the chat who was participating. Thank you to everybody for listening. And that brings us to the end. So I'm Elle Jones, and I'm throwing back to Desmond to give us his good night. And then we are all out. And as you said, you can pick up this book. Please do get it at your local bookseller, but you can also order it online. And yeah, hopefully that you all order it, get presents for people and spread it around. And Desmond, go ahead.
Thank you once again to our co-sponsors for this event. Thank you to Between the Lines. Thank you to Another Story Bookshop. Thank you to our media sponsor, Briar Patch Magazine. Please support the work of all of these organizations and local bookstores and local groups who are trying to bring you these perspectives. Thank you so much to the tech team behind, to those doing the descriptive video. We want to thank everybody who's made this possible, and we wish all of you a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you so much, the editors. If you could just give us a wave as well for all that hard work. So we have Kevin, Abby, and Sherry that edited the collection, and that's it.
Thank you to our hosts. Thank you to our amazing hosts. That was incredible. That was
like a nightmare gym teacher where you're like, we made it. I said I'd be happy we made it under 2. We have made it under 2 hours. So with that said, it is a long weekend. Thank you all for joining us on the eve of this long weekend. Take care of yourselves. Be safe. Love each other. Care for each other. Abolition is found in those daily acts. Have a good night, everybody.